Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Swan Signal Live. I'm your host, Sam Callahan, lead market analyst at Swan Bitcoin. We got a great show lined up for you guys focused on Bitcoin and energy. But before we get started, I want to mention Pacific Bitcoin. That is the Bitcoin festival that Swan throws every year in beautiful Santa Monica. If you go to the QR code right here, you can get 10% off if you use the promo code Signal. And if you pay with Bitcoin, you'll get an additional 21% off. Right now, all tickets can be refunded in full if it's before February 1st. If you were there last year, you understand that this is a very fun educational festival where people get together, Bitcoiners in real life. You learn from all the best Bitcoiners in the space, the biggest thought leaders. And it's really cool because it's very small and you can actually have conversations with them in person. And there's all kinds of satellite events and workshops to learn about how to use Bitcoin. So check it out at pacificbitcoin.com. On today's episode, we are going to be focused on energy with a foremost energy expert, Mr. Alex Epstein. He's an author of Fossil Future, as well as The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Those amazing books are right behind him. So if you haven't read them, go check them out. But welcome to the show, Alex.
These are the huge type versions, This poster is like 6 feet tall. So and definitely Fossil Future. You don't need to read the first one anymore.
I like the first one. I mean, that really opened my eyes. And one of
the things it had its time for sure, and it's a great title. And if only I could reuse that title. But Fossil Future is kind of a replacement for it, and is a lot more developed argument. So I always just tell people just read that one.
All right,
420 pages long, so it's plenty to read.
It is, and what I love about your writing is it's very first principles based, and you use a lot of facts, a lot of data. You can tell that there's a ton of research that goes into your books. And one of the things that you focus on is the attack on fossil fuels, obviously. And the push from governments for carbon zero by 2050, and these other initiatives that you call anti-human. And one of these pushes that we've seen is ESG, right? But over the last couple of years, at least from my perspective, we've kind of seen that narrative start to crumble a little bit. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch on, do you think that's happening right now in terms of ESG, where we're seeing kind of a sentiment shift? And how do you feel about that?
There's definitely a shift, and I feel good about it. I would like to see more. But, one way to think of it is every irrational movement has an expiration date on on any kind of ubiquitous popularity. So if you look at, say, ESG, I started really noticing 2017, 2018. One of the things I did more in the past, I don't really do it too much now, but I would advise energy companies, including oil and gas companies, on messaging. So how do you actually explain what you do in a way that's effective and that's true, et cetera? And they were all getting really into this environmental social governance stuff. And my view was, well, this is a movement that's clearly aimed at your destruction. The central component of environmental is essentially get rid of fossil fuels by 2050. Net zero by 2050 basically means get rid of fossil fuels by 2050. This is an anti-you movement. And yet it was so ubiquitous, so popular that everyone felt like they had to participate in it. But the thing is, that can never last if it's irrational, including anti-human, because the consequences will play out. It's kind of like if you have a political candidate with really bad ideas. I mean, let's just take a pure socialist or a pure communist, right? There's a period where they're going to have popularity when those ideas haven't been tried. But because the ideas are irrational, once they get tried, they're going to have negative consequences. And the person will often try to separate themselves from the consequences, say, well, it wasn't me, right? It was this other thing, et cetera, et cetera. But then you start to see those consequences play out. So the basic idea of ESG was and it was basically started at the UN, but we kind of modern, let's just say left socialist collectivist types, it's actually better for everyone, including you, to run your corporation according to our political beliefs versus what's actually profitable, right? That's kind of what ESG means. If you follow our norms, so if instead of producing what's most profitable, you try to go to net zero by 2050, and instead of hiring people based on merit, you hire them based on skin color. And if you do all of these other things that don't make any sense from a profit perspective, it's somehow going to be good because this is somehow going to satisfy all the stakeholders and everyone will love you and that'll somehow translate into it's like very, very implausible, but
Mhm.
everyone was on it. But it doesn't make any sense. And so what happens is, well, people start doing things that are unprofitable and otherwise irrational. And then guess what? They stop making profits. So there was a natural kind of failure mode that this was bound to reach. And then on top of that, I think there have been some good cultural trends where people have been amplifying that failure mode, or they've been highlighting it and making sure that the blame goes to ESG. And this is very important because often when an irrational movement yields a lot of destruction, it still claims that it's been vindicated. And it's always making excuses. Like we had the Texas failure in 2021 of their grid. We could talk about the details, but the wind and solar people claimed that somehow this is the fault of fossil fuels. Like fossil fuels somehow caused this, even though
Yeah.
fossil fuels provide grid stability everywhere in the world under every imaginable weather condition. And you guys had just forced a huge amount of wind and solar on the grid and just hugely disinvested in fossil fuel infrastructure, including resiliency. But it's somehow like it's somehow solar and wind. We just need more of that, even though there was basically no solar and wind when they needed it the most. Like people are always making excuses. So it's a really good thing when the critics of something are really blaming it. And you can see that with ESG on the energy side. I would say in particular on the kind of what I would call the racism side of it, we know that what they call DEI, but it has a real racist element where it's judging people by skin color, which is the essence of racism. You're seeing people in particular single that out. So I think it's good that this is happening, but I think we can criticize it even more. And I think the most important thing, which is really the center of my work right now, is offering a positive alternative. So not just saying to take the conventional thing like woke is bad, like or DEI is bad, but what's your alternative? Like
Yep.
you need an individualistic alternative. And the same thing with energy is not just okay, ESG went too far in terms of being rabidly anti-fossil fuels, but what's a positive vision for the future in energy? And that I think is the next thing that's needed when this irrational movement starts to get exposed.
Yeah, one of the signs that maybe the ESG movement is faltering a little bit was I think you've seen 28 ESG funds close shop and get liquidated. And then BlackRock just laid off a lot of employees, and BlackRock
Yeah.
was one of the biggest proponents of ESG. And it felt like to me, one of the biggest inflection points was when Russia invaded Ukraine, and it really put under the spotlight the energy policies in Europe. Do you agree with that? And then what kind of lessons do you think the world learned from that?
Yeah, it was so whenever you have a crisis, you can think of it as the only good thing is it's a potential learning opportunity. It's very important. It's not a guaranteed learning opportunity because the people who caused the crisis will always interpret, a lot of them will always interpret the crisis in ways that vindicate them. So some people said, oh, if only Europe had invested more in wind and solar. Like this was a real argument that people made, even though they clearly desperately needed natural gas. But yeah, I think most people woke up and said, wait a second, Europe has been opposing fossil fuels recently. They've been gutting their own capacity to get them. They banned fracking throughout the continent. They had no interest at all in securing, say, supply from the United States. And then suddenly they need a lot more natural gas and they're afraid of winter, which how embarrassing is that for Europe to be afraid of winter? Like it's like winter is coming, right? It's like Game of Thrones. It's supposed to be a medieval narrative and it's a
Yeah.
modern narrative. So it's like
Well,
people
they're
are saying, wait a
burning
second.
wood, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have all these, kinds of stories about like sometimes people burning used library books and huddling in buses and stuff. I mean, it's a real regression. And
Mhm.
people see, wait, that seems to have something to do. They seem to lack fossil fuels, and maybe that has something to do with the people that said we should lack fossil fuels. So people are making that connection, and that's good. But my view as that was happening was just we can't take for granted they'll make the connection. We need to emphasize that, but then also push for something positive. So often when there's an irrational movement, including an anti-freedom movement, the people who are generally more rational and pro-freedom, they focus too much on victories criticizing the opposition instead of victories putting forward something positive. And in fact, I always use Bitcoin as an example of the right way to do this, which is a fascinating thing because I've been anti-fiat money ever since I understood the idea. Let's say I was 18 years old, so I'm 43 now, so I've been 25 years. But nobody that the movement of being anti-fiat money was nowhere. I mean, for so long, like there was no one that was not a popular cause, right? Nobody cared about it at all. And then what Bitcoin did was it introduced something that at least had the potential of saying, hey, wait a second, we can have a better alternative in terms of, oh, here's something where we can like we can have this thing that the government can't inflate and in some ways has some properties that gold doesn't. And like that was really exciting. And then people got onto it. Now, part of it is people thought they could make money off it. And that's for sure a nice thing to have. And I don't have the equivalent for supporting energy freedom. Like you'll make more money indirectly by the world being better, but like you won't get a huge gain if you invest in this at a given point. But nevertheless, it's a really good thing to show. Wait, Bitcoin had a positive vision of the future, and that helped it criticize fiat. And this is a universal thing. The more you have a positive vision of the good, the more effective you can be at criticizing the bad. And so it's always a mistake to just criticize the bad and not have a positive alternative.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people these days focus on the problems, but they don't offer any solutions, and that's not
Yeah.
constructive.
And
Um,
solutions are hard. That's the a big reason. I mean, there's maybe psychological reasons why people like focusing on the problems, but it's so like real solutions are hard. For instance, my main I haven't done a long interview in a while, and part of the reason is because I've been in the lab working on energy freedom policies, which means detailed policies for legislators and maybe the next president to use. And let me tell you, it's really hard to come up with what's a detailed nuclear policy that can actually fix nuclear energy. It's a hell of a lot easier to say, hey, the existing policy is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense, which is true. But figuring out the right policy in the right level of detail is very hard. So, but
yeah,
that's the work that needs to be done. Like in general, when there's a bad movement, usually you don't have a ready-made good movement just ready to plug in. So you need to focus on how do we create that. It can't, and even if you had a better movement in the past, so much has changed. So it can't just be this conservative attitude of, okay, let's just go back to the way things were 80 years ago and that'll be fine. Like there wasn't even really nuclear energy in a meaningful sense 80 years ago. Like we didn't have that. And for a lot of these things, even if you take the DEI stuff, it's nobody really worked out a positive individualistic alternative to that. In a sense, DEI is a regression, but also we had real problems with racism in the world and in this country. And so if you want to counter that aspect of it, I know it's not the focus of this show, but offer something that's really positive, inspiring, individualistic, highlighting the kind of Martin Luther King judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Don't simply say, oh, woke is bad, this affirmative action is bad. Because if you do that, then they're still going to have momentum because they're still going to have the high ground of, okay, we care about this cluster of issues, we have plans, and all you have is criticisms and criticizing the woozy word woke.
yeah. It's always better to attract people to your side of the argument with some honey than just straight vinegar, right? And you brought up fiat, and I
Mhm.
think fiat money and the poor energy policies are deeply intertwined because there's no cost to capital. And so you can print money and you can put it into these unprofitable endeavors that are really driven by, I would say, political agendas. Not really, it doesn't make economic sense. Um, and so we've seen a lot of underinvestment in fossil fuels, and a lot of your work focuses on the benefits of fossil fuels. It's low cost, it's incredibly versatile, it's scalable. But we've seen a ton of underinvestment, and it's part of the reasons why I think we're in for a more inflationary decade is because there has been so much underinvestment in fossil fuels. Do you think that's like reversible? If we are seeing a shift in the ESG, do you think we're about to see more investment in fossil fuels? And how long do you think this is going to take for us to actually see some meaningful improvements on that front?
It's really hard to say. So the general point is I agree with you. I mean, I am scared generally of suppressed supply of fossil fuels. And for sure, we could have more abundant energy now if we didn't have all these anti-fossil fuel policies. Uh, I mean, particularly with maybe oil is the kind of scariest because you hear there's a big movement. I mean, for instance, who was it? I think it was Senator Whitehouse or Senator Markey. Well, I mean, those two are almost identical in terms of just trying to lead the charge against fossil fuels. One of them was at COP28, this UN conference, and they said basically, hey, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, advocated that we stop new infrastructure development for oil and gas by 2022, and we haven't done it yet. So let's get on that. Like, let's do that right now. And my reaction was, did you not just see what happened in Europe? Like, they were terrified of winter. Like, they obviously much more is needed. Obviously, the conclusion to draw is not let's do what we pledged to do, but what we pledged to do is insane, and let's make a totally different pledge. But you can see there's still this momentum because all the commitments that people are making to change course are very short term. So it's kind of like, oh, we had blackouts in California in 2020, so Newsom secures some additional natural gas supply for 2021, right? But he doesn't reverse course. And
Hmm.
this is the thing. It's often you get these short-term reversals and then people don't pay attention, but you're not getting the long-term reversal. So we have this long-term suppression of supply of oil and gas, but let's just focus on oil. Well, the problem with that is one is you can expect more demand in an energy poor world. You still, most of the world's still using very little energy by our standards. Most of the world has never flown in a plane once. So most of the world doesn't have a car. So there's just so much value that people can get from oil. And we could talk about EVs, but I don't think those are scaling anywhere near as quickly as would be necessary to reduce demand for oil. So you've got demand for oil. And then the way oil supply works is oil, to get even the same supply, you need to constantly be drilling because oil reserves deplete, right? So they go down over time. So if you just stop new infrastructure, that you don't get the same amount of oil energy, you get a depleting amount of oil energy. So we constantly need to do that. At the same time, kind of the nature of exploration is you need to get more technologically sophisticated over time, because part of how you are able to expand production is discovering ways to harness new forms of raw, what you can call hydrocarbon, like the oil under the ground. Like what we've been able to do in the US with shale, we couldn't do 20 years ago cost effectively. So you need that kind of innovation. And what all these things point to is you need investment. You need huge amounts of investment. Investment is a long-term game. So what happens is when you have all this net zero mania, including in the investment world, you start to, it's like you're harming the foundations, and you're very, very vulnerable. And that's what I worry about, is we're just harming the foundations of this thing that's necessarily long term in terms of investing in the oil supply we need to not only preserve existing production, which is hard enough, but then increase production. So this is it scares me a lot, and it's a hard thing to reverse, because what you would really want is you need to reverse the overall movement and the long-term commitments. What we're seeing now is just sort of a slowing of it and some short-term reversals, and that's not enough.
Hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about positive alternatives. You brought up nuclear energy, and it's one of the things that baffles me is the fight against nuclear energy, because I feel like it's very promising, let's say, competitor to fossil fuels, and there's no air pollution, there's no CO2. So if these people really care about that, and it seems like a very sustainable way to get energy, but there's like seems to be a group of people that consistently fight against nuclear. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on it, and maybe how you would debate the virtues of nuclear energy, and why do you think there is this movement fighting against it?
Well, yeah, nuclear. I mean, the anti-nuclear movement is horrible. Interestingly, though, the pro-nuclear movement is sometimes dangerously optimistic,
Okay.
given the current state of policy. So we'll talk about the new anti-nuclear movement. Basically, the anti-nuclear movement has ruined policy to a degree that is massive and needs to be appreciated, and that severely limits the near-term prospects for nuclear. So you want to be aware. I think the thing is, nuclear is an incredibly promising technology that has been tragically sabotaged by government, but we need radical policy reform. And that's where I think my fellow pro-nuclear people don't appreciate enough what's needed. It's not simply enough to change sentiment, which has happened quite a bit. It's we need radically different policies. So just the quick version is, nuclear is actually the safest form of energy ever created in terms of empirically, in terms of the logic of it. The basic thing is it can't explode. An explosion is the biggest. I mean, the things are, it can't explode and it doesn't put anything into the air. And those are the two things that cause damage. One is causing damage to locals. Nuclear, if you have a meltdown, which is very, very rare, it's very slow, which is a huge advantage. You have time to evacuate. The amount of radiation that escapes, even when that happens, has never harmed anyone in the civilized world. Chernobyl was a type of reactor we would have never used, never considered using. But if you look at the civilized world, even with the meltdowns, people have time to evacuate. Sometimes they over evacuate, and the amount of radiation that escapes and the rate at which it escapes is not a danger to human health versus anything else which can explode. Even solar panels can catch fire, wind turbines, but let alone like coal plants and gas plants and this and a dam for, say, hydroelectric that can collapse, kill 10,000, 100,000 people. So nuclear is incredibly safe to locals, and it's also safe in terms of any kind of contamination. It doesn't put anything into the air under its normal use. So it's great in that respect, and yet it's been demonized as the most dangerous. Now, I talk about the motives for this in Fossil Future. The basic thing is the anti-fossil fuel movement, I believe, is really an anti-human impact movement. So they're against humans modifying nature, and nuclear gets a lot of hostility. One, because nuclear is modifying nature in a new way, generating energy with radioactivity and radiation. That's a new way that anti-impact people don't like. Also, it has the potential to produce a lot more energy than anything ever has. So people who hate impact don't like energy, so they don't like the prospect for a lot more energy as well. So it's generated this hostility, and that hostility has been cleverly manifested into making people think nuclear is dangerous, even though it's uniquely safe. So that's manifested then in a political framework where it's almost impossible to build new nuclear without just unbelievable cost. So if you look at, say, the normal cost of building nuclear since the late 60s has gone up by a factor of 10. And since the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was established, this is 1975, so 5 years before I was born, this happened. We only recently approved 2 plants. Only 2 plants have gone from conception to completion in Georgia, and those cost 30 times what the plants used to cost 45 or 50 years ago. So think about that. Like, how can this possibly happen? It's obviously a government thing. It's not that everyone got dumb, right? These things should have been cheaper. Now you're talking 30 times more expensive. So what's needed is, we need to realize is nuclear has been effectively criminalized, and it needs to be decriminalized. But this needs very, very radical reform. So just one example is the way we set the allowable amount of radiation from nuclear needs to be based on science. Right now, it's based on science fiction, and in particular, the idea that any amount of radiation that escapes from a nuclear plant is deadly. And the technical thing is called linear no threshold. So it basically means that danger is proportional at every level. So an analogy somebody gave me is, if 100 people die falling 100 feet, that means 10 people are going to die falling 10 feet, and 1 person is going to die falling 1 foot, 1 out of 100, right? That's not how things work at all. That's not how these things work. Often they're very nonlinear. And it's the same thing with nuclear. At low doses, radiation is either neutral for human life, or it can even be beneficial for human life. But because we treat it as all toxic, it leads to just a crazy amount of overregulation, overbuilding, et cetera. So that's one of many things that's going on. But this whole thing needs to be changed. And one of my big projects for this year is a nuclear decriminalization policy. And I just want to say to the nuclear advocates, you're totally right that nuclear is amazing in its potential, but we need to radically change the policy. It's not enough just to say, hey, nuclear has potential. And you sure as hell do not want to be suppressing fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are needed for the foreseeable future, because nuclear is not going to scale really quickly anytime soon. And the world is really energy poor. So we need many more people who are both totally pro fossil fuels and totally pro nuclear.
I couldn't agree with you more. It just sounds like the nuclear has just been tied down with a bunch of regulatory hurdles or permits, and that's kind of stopped innovation from proceeding. And one of the groups that is against nuclear for years now is Greenpeace.
Oh yeah,
and they are also very against Bitcoin. And so,
of course,
yeah. And I was wondering, this is a common FUD that you hear from about Bitcoin from critics is Bitcoin is bad for the environment.
Yeah.
And you are an energy expert, and I just wanted to hear maybe your response to that critique. How would you respond to, hey, Bitcoin's using all this energy, blah, blah, blah. For me, I always say, well, it's worth every single watt to have a decentralized store of value that anybody can send over the internet peer to peer. It's worth the energy. But how would you, maybe argue against that critique?
So I'd argue against that critique, but actually it doesn't have that much to do with being an energy expert. It's more being a humanist philosopher, because I think the whole conception is anti-human. But I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but what do you think they even mean when they say Bitcoin is bad for the environment?
Well, I
What do
think
you,
that they mean is that, I don't agree with it at all, but they're
no, no, I
basically
know, but what does that even mean, bad
equating
for
the
the
amount of
environment?
energy that's being used. They see that as wasteful because they don't
Mhm.
understand, the value that Bitcoin can bring. They see it as wasteful, and that energy could be used elsewhere for more, beneficial purposes. That's kind of
Mhm.
the heart of the argument that I see. And for me, I think it's just an misunderstanding of what Bitcoin is, and also what energy is, because they actually blame the ASICs themselves, which aren't emitting any CO2, instead of looking at kind of the resources, the energy resources that the miners are using. And so there's a lot of like misconceptions and misunderstandings of what Bitcoin is and how Bitcoin mining works, kind of tied into that narrative. But yeah, I would love to just hear your thoughts, or if you agree with what I just said.
I agree. There's a lot. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, but I think just I'd never use the term bad for the environment. The reason is because I think the term the environment is designed to make us think about our environment in an anti-human way. Because really, like, let's just say, let's say, Bitcoin thesis is right, right? That Bitcoin is a new and superior form of currency. Well, what will that do for the world as we experience it? It'll make it much, much better, right? It'll make us much more productive. It'll make the world much more fair, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, sure, you've thought through many more of the implications than I have. But so in a sense, it will make our environment better. Like our environment, the world we live in, will be made much better by having a far superior form of currency. And but when they talk about the environment, what do they mean? Because if you say it's bad for the, well, I think it will be good for the human environment, be good for the world, including, by the way, to allow us to preserve nature more because we're more productive and prosperous and stuff. And what they're focused on is it's bad. What people usually mean by the environment is they mean at the best they mean the non-human. So they mean
Mhm.
it affects the non-human adversely. So it's going to quote affect the climate adversely, but it doesn't even mean. And like my focus is, why am I focused on the non-human as a human? Why am I focused on the non-humans? Like, is this good for the non-human or not? Is it bad for the non-human? That's not how I measure things. I measure things by, are they good for the human? Now I care about non-human things, but I care about them for human reasons. So like I love going on safaris, I love being outdoors, but I care about those things for human reasons. Whereas when you talk about the environment, it's the idea that you care about the non-human as an end in itself. And in particular, it's even worse. It's really saying bad for the environment really means it's impacted by humans. So it's treating the idea that all of our impact is innately bad, even if this is how perverse it is, even if it makes the environment of other animals better, it's bad. So, for example, we treat the whole thing about Bitcoin is it's going to lead to more CO2 emissions, but CO2 emissions lead to greening, right? They lead to a
Mhm.
greener Earth and they lead to warming, particularly in colder places. And that is good for a huge amount of life, obviously. Even if you think it's adverse to some, it's obviously good, right? In general, a warmer world is a better world for life, and a world with more CO2 is a better world for life. And yet it's called bad for the environment, and it's assumed that, oh, if we put more CO2 it's bad for the environment, even though it obviously has good consequences on humans and non-humans. And it's because it's based on this view that good for the environment really means bad for the environment means impacted by humans, and it's the view that human impact is evil and we
Mhm.
shouldn't do it at all. And that's why I sort of going on about this. I
Yeah.
hate that expression because good for the environment, bad for the environment translates to was impacted by humans, that's bad, or wasn't impacted by humans, that's good. And we just need to totally get rid of that way of thinking of it. We should think of the world as our environment. And something like Bitcoin that has amazing potential to help human life is good for our environment. So that's how I
Mhm.
think of it. Now, the specific thing is they claim, oh, well, we're going to be using more energy, and a bunch of it is going to come from fossil fuels, and that's going to mean more CO2, and that's climate change, and that's bad. And so the argument there is the one you made is I would translate it to, we are using energy and machines to create something valuable. We should be proud of that. And the value certainly exceeds any negative side effects. I think that's the way to think about it is, hey, if Bitcoin is as valuable as you guys are saying, then you should be proud of that. In the same way you should be proud of using an antibiotic that saves a lot of lives, even if it has side effects. In the same way you should be proud of everything has side effects, right? So the main thing is to stand up for the value of using the energy and to defang the idea that the side effects are catastrophic. And we could talk about that, but basically they're not catastrophic because I mentioned in many ways there are benefits to a warmer world. Far more people die of cold from heat. But the main thing is the energy you get while you're emitting the CO2 is far more consequential climate wise in terms of benefiting you than the side effects, because energy allows you to deal with any climate. So we have a lot of energy in the US. We deal with polar Alaska, swampy Florida, Texas, whatever. It's pretty easy. The rate of disaster death from climate related causes, is down by a factor of 50 over the past 100 years. So energy matters much more in general than any climate impact that we have. And it even matters much more climate wise. So that's the kind of Alex Epstein part of
Yeah,
it.
I love that.
But you put it in the context of it's good to use energy. Like we need to be proud to use energy. And we need to get rid of this idea that it's wrong for us to impact things. No, it's good for us to impact things. And that's why I hate this term bad for the environment, because it assumes our impact is bad. And no, our impact is overwhelmingly good. And if it's bad in a specific way, because it's bad for us, let's correct that. But let's stop treating ourselves as like these lepers who don't deserve to exist or something.
Yeah, it reminds me of this chart. It was GDP per capita is directly correlated to energy consumption per capita, which
Yeah.
you kind of replace with standard of living. So if you care about making life better for people, you should support harnessing more energy, right? And not
Yeah.
less.
And we should be
Um,
excited about that. And the
yeah.
fact, but if you hate impact, you hate energy, because energy makes life better because it impacts the earth to be better than it would otherwise be. Naturally, earth is very inhospitable. So that's why we can't have this worship of unimpacted nature or non-human nature. We
Mm,
need to, if we're going to quote worship anything, it should be human ability to improve nature to make it a better place for us. And energy is central to that.
100%. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you're starting to hear Bitcoin actually be framed as the most ESG asset.
Yeah.
There's a report from KPMG that basically talked about the virtues through an ESG lens. From the Eve perspective, they brought up like Bitcoin being able to reduce methane flaring, for instance. From the S standpoint, it's better for financial inclusion. It has cheaper, international payments than traditional payment methods. Or the G, it's a new form of governance, decentralized, resistant to manipulation and corruption. And so you're starting to see that framing. Do you think as a community we should just reject that completely? Or do you think maybe we should lean into that just to get people to support Bitcoin, even though we know ESG is kind of baloney? Do you think it might be like a Trojan horse kind of situation where at least they'll get to think about Bitcoin in a positive light?
I mean, I hate these kinds of things. It's just, no, and I don't think they work. And
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, what I would say is, insofar as, so ESG is a package of a bunch of stuff, mostly BS. But insofar as there's anything legitimate in it, don't call it ESG, but you can think about it. So, for example, with the issue of flaring, there's an issue of, in large part, because we don't build enough infrastructure because of the green movement, we
Mhm.
have what's called stranded gas, particularly when you drill for oil in certain places. There's what's called associated gas. So there's natural gas that you can't make use of. And so you do what's called flaring it, which is burning it for safety reasons, because this gas could otherwise explode and kill people. So flaring is a good thing. It's not an evil thing, because you're doing it as part of getting energy that improves human life. But all things being equal, you'd rather make use of the energy. So it's true that Bitcoin, you can set up Bitcoin mining with these kinds of remote things. That, by the way, that argument totally depends, though, on people valuing Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, because otherwise what you're doing is you're still burning the energy and generating CO2. You're generating Bitcoin value from it. But if you don't think Bitcoin is valuable, it doesn't help. And in any case, this is not, quote, saving the planet from CO2. This is not decarbonizing the planet to use Bitcoin in this way. So I think of it as, it's a value prop. Like, talk about it as a value proposition. Think in terms of, I've coined the term not ESG, but LVC, like long-term value creation. So talk about that. You can also talk about environmental quality stuff. And if and to the extent Bitcoin, well, we can talk about the details, but if and to the extent Bitcoin can actually help make, say, something like solar and wind more valuable forms of energy, that's good. But it should be in terms of, hey, this is more valuable forms of energy, not Bitcoin is going to help us decarbonize. Bitcoin is not going to help us decarbonize because Bitcoin is a significant increase in energy. Now, relative to everything we use energy for, it's not that big, but it is a significant use of energy. It uses more than a lot of countries do. And that's totally fine. That should be embraced insofar as you think Bitcoin is valuable. But increasing the amount of energy used in the world is not decarbonizing the world in a world where fossil fuels are still uniquely cost effective for most purposes.
Hmm. Let's talk about some of these narratives around Bitcoin mining. A lot of proponents of Bitcoin are really excited about it as a promising technology for the energy industry for a lot of different reasons. We already mentioned, methane flaring or utilizing stranded energy resources. But another one is stabilization of the grid. As like a flexible load, miners can turn on and off with a click of a button much more easily than other forms of energy, like say like a hospital, to kind of give energy back to the grid when they need it, and then they kind of turn back on when there's low utilization. Do you think that narrative has legs, or do you think that maybe it's a little bit overblown? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's just I would just say in general, always worry about these opportunistic and convenient narratives and subject them to some scrutiny and be aware in one's own thinking. Not you, because I don't think you're sympathetic to this, but like, just be aware when it seems a little bit too convenient for your own kind of short-term interest in the sense of, oh, wouldn't it be great if all these, well, I'm calling them maniacs, but let's just say all these people who are against fossil fuels and sort of hostile to more energy use, they suddenly loved Bitcoin. Like that would be convenient and it suddenly helped their cause.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that would be convenient, but it doesn't really make any sense. So you think about, I mean, what are you actually talking about here with the grid? So you're saying, I'm going to buy this incredibly expensive Bitcoin mining equipment and I'm going to choose to operate it not based on ideal market conditions for profiting off Bitcoin. I'm going to do it based on demand on the grid. So if there's prime time for me to mine Bitcoin, I'm not going to do it because I'm going to lay off right now, and I'm just going to let this capital investment that I've made, that which by the way depletes in value all the time because there's always new superior technologies. I'm just going to let that sit idle huge amounts of time so that I can quote unquote help the grid.
Hmm.
Like, is this
In terms of the
really
ASIC machines, that's what
what's
you mean?
that?
In terms of the ASIC machines, that's what you mean?
I
Like
just mean
letting them
all the
sit idle?
mining equipment. I mean, this is all just
Yeah.
based on computation.
Yeah.
Computation is improving all the time. So you make these, you're basically, I mean, when you're buying something, you're basically renting it for its useful life. You can just think of that. So you're saying, I'm going to buy this very expensive equipment and I'm not going to use it a huge amount of the time, including time when it'd be very valuable, because I'm trying to help solar and wind on the grid. Like this just is one should be very skeptical of this kind of thing. And it's often going to depend on subsidies and this, but it just doesn't make any, like in general, unreliable energy is not very valuable. And this is just the thing. And why should it be? And why should we be so obsessed as a society with how do we adjust ourselves to the weather? That's this obsession, right? How do we adjust Bitcoin to the weather? How do we adjust industry to the weather? Like, this just a ridiculous, like we need to adjust the weather. That was the life that we used to live, right? Where we just are the victims of the weather and we're at the mercy of the weather. Like what the electricity grid created, starting with coal, is the ability to match uncontrollable demand with highly controllable supply. That's the achievement of the grid. And now we're regressing to the point where we're focusing on, okay, how do we not demand when we actually want something, but we demand it when the weather is compliant? And so I think Bitcoin trying to fit itself into this is very weak. That's different from the stranded case where you can say, well, we can get this product uniquely cheaply. And we really do have a kind of unique offering because we can engage in computation in this one isolated location. And then, of course, you're interacting with the rest of the world, but it's like you don't need nearly as much infrastructure interact with the rest of the world digitally as you do in terms of having a pipeline or having a long distance transmission line to handle the electricity. So the stranded case makes a lot more sense than this other case. Are there cases where this thing might work? Maybe. But in general, what people are going to do is they're going to find really cheap ways of producing energy that are controllable, that are 24/7, and they're going to use that to optimize Bitcoin mining. And that includes things like using coal in places where it's cheap to use coal.
Mm-hmm.
And you should not be against that. I mean,
yeah, no, so like you're essentially saying, but there is this overcapacity of solar and wind. We're not going to change that, driven by this green movement. And that causes all these problems with the grid. And yeah, like Bitcoin's kind of benefiting from those problems by acting like a solution to them. When you say that, we shouldn't even be trying to fix that, like we should be
the question
focused on trying to fix the underlying problem of the
well,
unreliable energy sources.
how much is this actually a thing that there's oversupply all of these different times? And again, just what are the economics of depending on these peaks? And like if somebody, it's plausible that somebody can make some money doing this, but this is not going to be the way all Bitcoin works. Is that you just because you're just depending too much on the variability of the weather on these other kinds of things. You're also, by the way, if there's actually cheap like sort of solar peak induced electricity or wind peak induced electricity, you're going to have other people trying to compete for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not just Bitcoin. It's just like usually like most factories, for example, like why aren't most factories over the moon about this? Why aren't most factories going to say, we're going to shut down? We're going to shut down most of the time. But when there's excess solar, we're going to manufacture the shit out of things because it's just not very convenient for their investments. It's not efficient to not run most of the time. The best times to operate are not the times when there happens to be the best solar. So it's just not going to be a thing that is, this is not an idea that has been thought through from the perspective of what is the most efficient way to mine most Bitcoin. It's an idea that's been thought through from the perspective of how do we get the climate people not to hate us? And I think it has a bunch of obvious flaws to it. Now, in general, no, we should not be encouraging the government to mandate and subsidize more unreliable electricity on the grid and shut down more reliable capacity. That is a disaster that is happening right now. And you absolutely don't want Bitcoin to be part of that. And one of the actual dangers of Bitcoin is it's part of a movement of increasing demand for reliable electricity and decreasing supply of reliable electricity. And that's a way in which Bitcoin will actually be demonized. And if you guys support the unreliables and mandating them and preferring them, then you'll be part of it because people are saying, wait a second, during this outage, people were mining Bitcoin and we didn't have enough electricity. And the point is, yeah, everyone has every right to mine Bitcoin anytime, but you shouldn't be contributing to reducing the supply of electricity.
But if we, if you brought up the factory example, it would just be more costly for a factory to shut down its operations in response and then turn back on, where the argument would be that Bitcoin miners are much more flexible and they kind of react, shut it down, shut it back off. And then they have power purchase agreements with the grid operators to get paid to do so. I don't know if you're familiar
that's
with that.
part of the scam. So it's made more valuable when you're getting paid, but that means other people are being ripped off.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, the whole power purchase agreement. So in general, if you look at the cost, like what is the cost of solar or wind? The actual cost of solar or wind or any other kind of raw source of energy is the full cost necessary to transform it into reliable electricity. And with solar and wind, so it's not just the solar panels, it's not just the transmission lines, it's whatever the life support capacity is. Say the natural gas, the coal, the hydro, the nuclear, that's giving it 24/7 life support. So what's the cost of solar and wind in Texas when they both dip below 1% capacity during Winter Storm Uri, right? The cost is the cost of all of that backup / life support. So the grids do all sorts of things to not fully make solar and wind pay for their full cost. And so what they do is they create all these different kinds of agreements that allow them to pretend that they're providing cheap electricity and then make everyone else pick up the expense. And so part of that is they can make a power purchase agreement with somebody where somebody says, hey, I'm going to pay the grid and we're going to label you as green. So we're going to pretend that all the electricity you're using comes from solar and wind. And then we're going to blame all your actual coal and natural gas use for everyone else. So Apple does this all the time. Like, we're paying for the credit for this. We're paying for other people to take the blame. There's all sorts of versions of this, but they almost always involve lying about who's actually using what kind of electricity, because everyone's just using an equal mix of everything at any given time.
Gotcha.
But they're also generally underpricing these things. So they're offering an artificially low price that then other people have to pay, in much the same way as I live in California, and my neighbors who have solar panels are just totally ripping me off. So they'll just say, oh, well, I have a great agreement with the government to get really cheap solar. But that's just ripping me off because they're not paying the full cost of their electricity. And so I'm paying more than the full cost of my electricity. So there's just all these different scams involved in ignoring the fact that unreliable electricity adds cost to the grid. Now, my solution for this policy-wise is simple. I think all the generators should be required to generate reliable electricity. And if they can do that, if they can combine solar and wind and batteries and gas and whatever, they should do that on their own. I think it's a lot simpler if every generating entity generates reliable electricity. This is what used to happen before we had solar and wind on the grid. And then if you can figure out a black box to do that, great. You can even use Bitcoin on your black box. I don't think it'll be that effective, but you can use it. But right now we allow them to sell unreliable electricity. We subsidize the hell out of it. We don't have a price penalty for the unreliability. And so part of what the Bitcoin is coming into with these power purchase agreements and other stuff is it's just part of looting the regular rate payers on the grid in the name of being green. So I just recommend don't be part of that. Don't pretend these fantasies are real. And again, there is huge vulnerability to being a major electricity user and participating in the degradation of the American grid.
No, I mean, it's a very nuanced topic, and it's thanks for sharing your thoughts. I mean, the stabilization of the grid.
But there's the factory thing. Let me just say the factory thing, because you mentioned the factory thing. Well, it's harder for them to stop and start the factory. It somewhat depends on the kind of factory. You might say because they need to have more reliable delivery. That's another cost. But in a certain sense, a lot of factory equipment improves at a much slower rate than mining equipment. So the cost of non-use is like the depreciation is not the same in terms of it as a slower depreciation.
Because
so
the chips get updated and the efficiencies improve.
Right. So it's just like with any kind of computation. I don't know. I don't think Bitcoin's any different than any kind of computation. A huge amount of like it's constantly increasing. It's constantly increasing, which means the current equipment in a competitive environment, the current equipment has a very limited shelf life in terms of being cost effective. So if you're talking about we're going to keep it off for like 12 hours a day, including sometimes the prime time in terms of pricing, like that's not utilizing very expensive capital equipment that depreciates very quickly. That is not a good financial plan for most people. So it just, no, I just think there are a lot of obvious flaws with this idea. And I don't think people are thinking them through because they're being opportunistic.
It's healthy to be skeptical about these things. This is why I want to talk to you today. What are some things you mentioned, the stranded energy, and what are some things about Bitcoin mining that do get you excited about the intersection of the energy industry? Is it just the stranded energy components that we already mentioned?
Well, it's not just stranded. It's sort of, let's just say remote is a broader use case. So you can think about developing, like there are other kinds of things that may make sense to develop in more remote cases and test them and refine them. So let's take nuclear. So something like one of the exciting ideas in the world is, well, could you use nuclear? And we have versions of this already, but have nuclear submarines. Can you use nuclear and have a ship? Because nuclear is so energy dense. It stores so much energy in a small amount of space. compared to anything, including oil, which is incredibly energy dense itself. So you can have you could have a nuclear ship that could power some obscure community for years and years and years, maybe even decades, right? That's something you can't possibly do with any other form of energy. So one thing is, let's say you're developing that, like there's some group developing this stuff in Indonesia. Well, maybe an effective way for them to test that out and develop that is to use it for Bitcoin mining at the beginning. So you don't have to say build out all the infrastructure and the transmission lines and stuff, but you still have a profitable use of electricity. So I can see major uses in terms of electricity innovation through remote locations. So you have a way of using remote electricity in a profitable way. And that's been some remote electricity generation, I should say, in a profitable way. Whereas historically, the value of remote electricity generation has been limited by lack of transmission because you need an end consumer to link it to. So I think there's just a lot of exciting stuff in that realm where it could help with at least the R&D of a bunch of other stuff. And I think that's where you want people experimenting. And it's not just nuclear. You could think of, hey, can we do this with geothermal? I know some people are thinking about doing this with tidal stuff. Like it could be a really good way to develop these things without having to connect it to the grid. So I know there's a guy, I forget his name, Nate, I think, who's working
Yeah,
on.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So he is an interesting guy. I think at one point he was set up as some adversary of mine for some debate. We ended up talking. He's an interesting guy, and he's trying to do tidal stuff. I think it was no, it's OTEC. Sorry, which is thermal energy in the ocean. We don't need to go into the details of that. But the whether it's with that kind of thing in particular, if you're doing stuff in the middle of the ocean, Bitcoin could make a lot of sense as an initial use case versus first to even validate it, having to connect it to a grid. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of
Mhm.
R&D stuff. And in general, I would just say Bitcoin should stand for using more energy more cost effectively and more efficiently to improve human life. It shouldn't stand for let's reduce our impact on the planet. Like that's a bad thing to stand for.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned all that because Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation was just on the show talking about how a trip to Africa, where he mentioned some of the things you just talked about in terms of utilizing remote energy resources with Bitcoin mining and how it helped the R&D process over there in these kind of remote areas of Africa. So you're seeing tons of examples of that. So I too am excited about that component of Bitcoin mining. Um,
But
you were on
he should.
the
But he and I like his stuff generally. But so I'm not saying him in particular. But he and others, like the thing to really be excited about is actually having development and industrialization and modern grids there. So it's great to do Bitcoin R&D and stuff. But you're talking about a place where what is it like? I was just talking with a friend like. You're talking about places with incomes of $1,000. Tanzania is like $1,200 a year. Kenya is like $2,000 a year. Very little energy use. That the main thing is just modern improvements in life. So I think part of being a good advocate of anything is, of course, you want to focus on it, but you also want to appreciate the other good values in life. So part of what I like about where you're coming from and Natalie and a lot of the other Bitcoin people I like are coming from is it's like Bitcoin as an aspect of improving human life versus just Bitcoin is the only thing that matters. Like all we need to do is
yeah.
Bitcoin. It's like people need really good currency and they need really good energy.
Yep. That's the idea would be they're mining Bitcoin so that they could save into money that can't be debased. A lot of them have currencies locally that are just completely corrupted and
Oh yeah.
manipulated and inflating. And so then they can invest it in energy
Yeah, no,
infrastructure
for
and maybe they
sure.
get reliable energy from that. It's like a stepping stone, right? To build out reliable infrastructure and maybe they get electricity in their homes
Yeah,
that
and
they
money
haven't
and
had.
energy you can think of as the two fundamentals of an economy. Right? So
Mhm.
it's sort of how you store value, and then your main way of creating value is through artificial energy, like going beyond your own limited human energy. So yeah, it's a totally fundamental thing. Just I like it when people are focused on the value of both, or
Got it.
in general focused on values versus just okay, I'm only focused on my one thing, including I'm willing to throw other things under the bus. Like let's throw fossil fuels under the bus because we want to support Bitcoin. It's like that's
I
not
see.
really much of a. I don't think it's honest, and I don't think it's all that effective. And the people think of it this way: the anti-impact movement that hates fossil fuels, that opposes nuclear and made it 10 to 30 times more expensive, those are not going to be your friends in supporting Bitcoin. There's no world in which they don't support nuclear. And by the way, hydro, they're going to love Bitcoin. It's just not going to happen. So you might
Mhm.
as well just be pro-human, pro-technology.
Well, your last question I want to ask is that you were on the show a couple of years ago, actually, and
Uh-huh.
you said you were interested in Bitcoin, and I'm just curious over the last couple of years. I mean, do you own it now? Why are you attracted to it? Is it still just this you support a free market and money itself? Is that the main thing that like attracts you to the promise of Bitcoin?
Well, I won't go. I do own Bitcoin, so I'll say that. I don't want to give my exact
No, you
holdings,
should
although
never do that.
a bunch I own through Swan, so you could probably look it up with your
Well,
but
no, I don't have access to that
not
information.
not an advertisement. But no, so I guess the thing is I try to be objective about what I can know and don't know. So I've always loved the idea of Bitcoin since I learned about it in 2011. I had no money back then, and I definitely didn't invest it in Bitcoin. So that was, one could reflect sadly. But I invested in myself, and it all turned out okay. So that was when I was starting my
I'd say
business.
so.
Has done fine. But yeah, I mean, I totally believe in a free market in money. I think that's fundamental. I think it's evil for the government to control the money supply. And I think there's a lot of plausibility in Bitcoin being like in having something that's digitally limited, sort of has like digitally creating some of the scarcity that gold has, but a lot easier to exchange. The but it's like I'm not is somebody who systematically thought through, for example, well, are there other ways of doing that? Like not talking about easily inflated things, but like could there be another Bitcoin that has the same basic properties that people would use? And there's just a whole bunch of things that I don't myself. I haven't thought through systematically. I don't know all the answers. I don't know if there are definitive answers to this. But I don't know. I love the idea. I myself, it's like it's a type of thing that I support in the world. And yeah, I do invest because I generally have significant optimism, but I'm not like, oh, all my holdings are in Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin went to zero, I'd be finished. I'm definitely not telling anyone to do what I do. But I
Right.
really do. I love the technology and the purpose of it, and I like that there's this, and I like the fact that it's a positive movement and that it's been so effective in challenging fiat. And I certainly believe in the freedom to do it, and I certainly believe that people who believe in it, including me, because I use it, should use energy proudly to pursue it.
Right on. Alex is on Team Bitcoin. That's great to have. It's great to have an asset like you, honestly. Like
Headline.
I think what Bitcoin has done is a lot of people have learned more about the energy industry because of it. A lot of
And I've
Bitcoiners.
met a lot of interesting people through it. Like, I got to go in a second, but
Yeah.
I've done jujitsu for a long time, and I'm just a hobbyist, but it's fun to see. Like, I've gotten to meet Ben Askren.
Oh yeah.
We got to,
At Pacific Bitcoin. Yeah.
yeah, well, I got to meet him there, but then I went to his gym, and he was very generous.
Oh, cool.
He gave me a lesson and just tooled me, which was really, I still remember like how he grips. So he's, that's and Kenny Florian, we haven't got to train, but I got to meet him through Bitcoin. And so you see a lot of people who kind of pro freedom, willing to think about things in a different way, generally pro human, pro technology. And I went to I spoke at the conference in 2022, and then I went last year just briefly to see Ben because we had never met in person, and I wanted
Yeah.
to go to
Yeah.
his little seminar. So you should do that. You should definitely have him again next
Yeah.
year.
Totally. That was a big hit. And
You just, yeah, don't have black outdoor mats. There's a couple of details that can
yeah,
be
I'll
improved.
pass that along to the
That,
Pacific Bitcoin team.
that can be
That's good
improved.
feedback right
But
there.
I do like it's that event is even before I had spoken uh, the first time. Like so many people come up to me and say, "Wow, you've really affected my thinking about things." And people usually give good reasons for it. So I find it's people who are really open to thinking about new things. And so I had a lot of fun talking to people there. And
Good.
if I'm
Well,
around, I'll stop by
yeah. Yeah, no, you
next
should
year.
definitely come back next year. I mean, we loved having you, and hopefully we get Ben back too. Just real quick, where do you wanna point people to your work,
Oh,
um,
okay.
your website, and then we'll let you go.
So I would say go. I mean, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. So Twitter is Alex at Alex Epstein. Instagram is at Alex Epstein Energy. And then energy talking points, which is my main thing these days, where I'm doing all the policy work. The Substack is the easiest way to find it, alexepstein.substack.com. So alexepstein.substack.com. And it's totally free to get all the talking points, but now there's actually Alex AI, which is a chat bot that answers all of your energy, environmental, and climate questions as me. You can even ask it about Bitcoin, and it has pretty good answers. So that's, if you get the premium version of my newsletter, you can get Alex AI. You can also try it out free on the App Store. So I think you just search Alex GPT on the App Store and do it. But yeah, if people do that, give me feedback. Yeah. We've sort of invested a ridiculous amount of time and money in it, but the goal is to replicate me so that everyone has access to me as a custom consultant, and ultimately a better version of me. So we're getting, it's pretty good already. It's not quite as good. It couldn't quite do this interview maybe as well as I can, but maybe next year.
Well, maybe I'll be talking to it, AI Alex, next year. Well,
yeah.
Go check out Alex's work. Go read his books if you haven't already. You'll learn a lot.
Oh yeah, Fossil Future, of course.
Yeah, Fossil Future. And thank you so much for coming on the show, and keep fighting the good fight at the policy level, pushing for positive alternatives and solutions. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, man. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
See ya.
Well, the reason why I love hosting Swan Signal is I get to talk to very, very smart people in different fields, and Alex Epstein didn't disappoint in terms of his expertise in energy. It is a rabbit hole in itself, and I'm learning with you all. So I hope you enjoyed that episode with Alex. Let me know what you thought about it. This is an exciting time in Bitcoin, and one of the most exciting parts for me is the intersection of the energy industry and Bitcoin. And so check out his book. Check out, energytalkingpoints.com. I've been there myself. It's just a great website for seeing little snippets of arguments, for fossil fuels, for quality energy policy moving forward, and go support Alex's work. Thank you again for listening. Always appreciate your support. We got another excellent episode next week with Fred Thiel from Marathon. So excited to have him on. I'm Sam Callahan, and I am out.